Hi, Nita. So great to have you here today.
I'm so grateful to be here with you, Marcos. Thank you. Thank you so
Um,
much. Thank you to you and Jen.
thank you. And I'm really excited to talk about your work with Be Free. We just had like a pre-interview conversation that could have lasted for like an hour. And I'm super excited to get into all the amazing work you're doing. So to kick it off, I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing with Be Free.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm going to start by doing this little exercise actually that we do. So I'm going to start with myself and then I'll share a little bit about Be Free.
Great.
But when we do this exercise, and I'll do it first, and then I'm going to invite you to do it. The exercise is called Locate Yourself. So we're going to locate ourselves in two ways. One is in the ways we primarily identify in the world, like just from a now, in this moment perspective. And then the second is, and I'll guide you through this a little bit, to locate yourself in the experience of your nervous system. And I'll talk about how that is related to anti-racism and equity work. So I will locate myself as a 42-year-old cisgender heterosexual woman who is currently in the East Village in New York, which is where I grew up. I'll add a little bit of story as well around like why I do this work. I am the daughter of East Indian immigrants. So I'm a first generation immigrant kid as part of how I think of myself as well. I'm the middle of three sisters. And one story I'll share that also feels very present to me today as I do this work is from third to fifth grade, I went to a school in Cambria Heights. So I grew up in Jamaica, Queens in New York, which was, in the late 70s, early 80s, which was a lovely place to be and a dangerous place to be. New York City in late 80s, like robbery was high, crime was high, drugs were part of the neighborhood that I grew up in, a lot of like activity around drugs and violence and gun violence were part of that experience too. So from third to fifth grade, I would take a bus from the neighborhood that I lived in to Cambria Heights, which is one of the wealthiest Black neighborhoods in New York, if not the country. And I think it still might be. And I went there because I was part of this program. It was a gifted and talented program. I got, something on a citywide test and they were like, do you want to be part of this? And I was like, I get to go on a bus and I get to go somewhere. And I was like, I like traveling. So I was like, yes, I want to do this. So at 7 years old, I made that decision. And it was a really amazing experience. Our principal, Mrs. Critchlow, was a Black woman. We were taught by Mensa. It was very project-based learning. And Black culture was exalted every day. We started our days in assembly as a big group, singing the Black national anthem. And the first couple of lines of which are lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. And I realized that there, and I will make the connection a little bit later, but this really beautiful experience of circling up together every morning, this ritual practice brought me into my body in a set of conditions where I felt highly unsafe and highly untrusting, right? Like the community that I was coming from, I felt actually like very safe with homeless people. I remember that. There was something about their vulnerability and their tenderness that really spoke to me. And I felt unsafe in the overarching context of just like the possibility of violence or other things that might happen. So I'll come back to why I feel that's important, but it feels relevant to today. And that was a really formative experience for me. Black culture was exalted every day in school. And I became very aware of the dissonance between the narratives about Blackness in America and about race in America in the context of my school, where, I was surrounded by these brilliant kids and these incredible teachers learning about the contributions of Black Americans to the United States of America and how formative and powerful they have been to who we are. And then stepping out into a world that had a very different narrative about what it meant to be Black. And this cognitive dissonance for me, and also the feeling of embodied safety I felt inside of my school in those rituals with my classmates, became a source of fuel and motivation for discovery and inquiry that has continued till today. So
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for your beautiful listening. I can like feel it. I'd love to invite you to locate yourself, because it also builds, it helps to build trust for me as well, just relational. Like I know you, but I haven't known you very long. And I think that when we are trusting our potential and our capacity, like I'm conscious of, we're here trying to offer folks some information and perspective on a topic that's really charged. And I know that my capacity to do that is served when I feel trusting. So I'm just going to invite you to do the same and locate yourself in this moment and the identities that feel most relevant to you.
Yeah. And one of the things I'll kind of share before I share my story, and thanks for sharing ahead of time and giving me that structure, is that when I think about like what a healthy relationship looks like, right? It's openness and transparency, but trust. And as I've been having all these conversations for within this topic, it comes down very much to that one word, trust. And how do you create trust and openness and safety and a safe place? And this is going to be something that I know we'll talk about in the work that you're doing in terms of creating a workplace that is a healing space.
Yeah.
So, and I'm interesting. This will be the first time that I kind of think of and do this in a while. So I'll just do it, because what you did is you took me back to a place and you made me think about so many things from my childhood. So Marcos Salazar, born in Taos, New Mexico, a beautiful small town in the northern part of New Mexico, from a very large Hispanic family. My mom has 9 brothers and sisters, my dad has 6 brothers and sisters. Wow. My grandfather had a good amount of land and gave everybody, all his 10 kids, an acre or so. So I grew up essentially in a my mom's last name is Chavez, so a Chavez compound. And Taos is predominantly an Hispanic, well, at the time, Hispanic population with a combination of Hispanic, white, indigenous, Native Americans, not few Black people, few Asian people, and other diversity. And I'll want to go back to why there are few so Black people a little bit later. But you're making me think about, I grew up in a very loving family, and I was very fortunate to be able to do that. And my parents always encouraged me kind of just to explore and be who I wanted to be. And you're making me think about, I don't know what the age was, 6, 7 years old, when maybe a little bit older, when my parents shared a story that they were forced to change their names when they were younger. So my mom's name was Sara, Sara, and they forced her to add an H to make it sound more English. My dad's name is Orlando, and they called him Orly to make it sound more English. But as I dove deeper and asked, I didn't understand what that concept was. My mom said, when I was a kid, we weren't allowed to bring tortillas into school. And she's like, I have a distinct memory of having to eat under the bleachers crying these tortillas because they were Hispanic foods. And for me, I had never really encountered that form of discrimination or racism. It was just beyond kind of my concept. And I grew up throughout that. I was very privileged throughout my youth to really not have faced that form of any kind of discrimination. And it took me a while in college, when I encountered a lot more people on the East Coast, of what that truly was and what that truly meant in terms of what people were facing. I remember, you're making me think of a story of a friend who grew up in East LA, who was Hispanic and was trying to describe everything that he went through. And I understood it intellectually, but I didn't understand it emotionally. And I think what you're sharing in terms of your experience is that I'm still in the process of my journey of understanding everything that we're going through. I've been super privileged, both on so many different levels, to not necessarily have encountered many of the things that so many people are facing today. And one of the reasons why I'm doing and wanting to do these conversations is to learn more in terms of figure out how I can make a greater impact and support those people.
Thank you so much for that. And I think this little demonstration, and I'm so appreciative of you sharing your story, because I want to say that I think ultimately some of the greatest possibility in the potential response we can have to the challenges we face and the polarization we face around race in this country and in the workplace, is to be really focused on our humanity. And stories are really humanizing. The other reason we use storytelling and exercises like this very deliberately in our work with folks is that, and this is to folks who feel similar to you, who feel like you're at an inception moment in your journey, is like, there's something non-threatening about stories. Like, we do them from the time we're kids, right? And we come to these conversations feeling already like self-protected, like there's a right or a wrong, and like knowing that there is going to be a charge in the conversation, right? Like it's by default, I think many people are coming into these conversations. We're also in a context right now, where things are charged, right? So many people are coming into a kind of like, COVID puts us on edge, and the election cycle puts many people on edge, irrespective of where you sit on the spectrum, and so being conscious that we're also bringing in a great deal of our context, and I think being able to kind of like locate ourselves can be a very grounding exercise, to just like be here in this moment and to acknowledge that all of this complexity, all of these stories, like one story for you led to three more, right? All of these stories are shaping the narrative that we have and the lens that we're bringing into these conversations. That's another reason we do the storytelling.
Yeah.
And the last is, I think stories are not polarized innately, right? They have all of these different perspectives. And for people who don't feel like you're conscious of your connection to race, I think once, or you feel like you may be privileged. And I think, in my view, everybody's privileged and disprivileged in different ways, right? That's not to take away from the fact that at a macro level, it is fair to say, right, collectively, like white people in the United States on the whole have been privileged from the lens of power and socioeconomic status and a number of other things in the United States, the way the healthcare system works, and many systems favor and are biased toward. And at the same time, privilege is dynamic, and that's we'll talk potentially a little bit about that. But the sort of whole point of this last piece on the storytelling and the power of it is everybody can locate themselves inside of race, even if they're absent of a consciousness of it. Once you start speaking about it from a storytelling perspective, because the dynamics that begin to arise are power, privilege, what you see and what you don't see, like all of those things start to come forward in a story, right? And it becomes a much easier way to kind of humanize and connect. So I would say that, and I start with that very intentionally, because that is a step one. Like, if you have no idea how to begin this conversation with folks, like, locate yourself and just notice what are the identities and the stories that come to the fore that shape the way you are experiencing this moment and the relationship that you're in.
Yeah. And I think I'm so glad that we did this. And I think you're completely spot on about this. When you're engaging in conversation with someone, and this is going to happen, friends, family, at work, with coworkers, it's so easy to get into the ideas and the intellect, and it's very easy to respond quickly and charged when it's on that level, versus this getting into your humanity in the story. And when you share it, or someone shares it with you, it's an opportunity to empathize, but also connect, and also possibly relate to that story. And that, like you mentioned, creates trust.
Totally. And what that opens me into, and I'm going to talk about the concept of workplace as healing space, to give a little bit of color on Be Free, is this idea, I love that you shared that, this is a tool that can be, and to call it a tool is sort of a funny thing. It's something we naturally do as humans, but it's a practice that can be applied to our relationships, irrespective of the context that we're in. And in many ways, our orientation toward the idea of workplace as healing space, which used to seem off kilter and odd, if not radical, to some people when we were first around and using the term more overtly. So I founded Be Free in 2013, and the original inquiry was really around like, what is the role that work can play in our lives? But I came from a background in education and business. And I would say for me personally and fundamentally that I'm a systems level thinker. Somebody was like, you're a relationships person. And it kind of cracked me up because I was like, that's not my self-concept. My self-concept is that I'm a systems thinker who's very interested in complexity and viewing the world through multiple disciplines. And that I do have this bent toward being humanitarian, maybe as a way to put it, or humanistic, human-centered. And that is really where the Workplaces Healing Space comes from. It's like, what is the role of work in our lives? One, like, what is its purpose? And can work actually contribute to, rather than detract from, our well-being? Right. And for me, that's, I don't know how often, to the point you made, when we are in reacting mode, in business mode, in working mode, that we are pausing to have these very fundamental inquiries that I think we collectively as a society and individually as people in our lives and our communities and homes need to be asking, like, why are we doing what we are doing? In service of what? And is it yielding the possibility that we'd actually like to be creating, or is it not? Right. And so that's part of why our inquiry started with people who were leaving the workplace. I found myself, when I was running a previous consultancy, like working with freelancers. I was just, people were coming for coaching and advice and support to start something new, because it's a really hard endeavor for folks. Right. And I really learned a lot about what people were leaving and why they were seeking to become free as freelancers. And that knowledge was then used to both support freelancers, which is one of the early iterations of Be Free. Was we launched a program that was holistic, that had an embodied wellness component, it had a business component, sort of like the spiritual and the material adjuncts to each other. It's just like, how can we create an environment that supports people to feel better, to view work as a vehicle that's going to contribute to their well-being fundamentally? Yeah, so the concept of Workplaces Healing Space, began with some of this learning about why people were leaving the workplace and what they were seeking, what they were hoping to create. And it was with that sense of possibility that we then also went back into organizations being like, hey, like, can we shift some of the conditions? Can we become more aware in organizations of why you're struggling with retention, or why the freelancer trend, which we're kind of agnostic about it. We wanted to support freelancers, but we were also like, different people need different paradigms, right? So, but why are folks leaving? The ones who are actively leaving and actively abdicating the workplace. And a lot of that circled me and us, and I have a team of co-creators, back to much of the work that I had done before that in the education system, which was about really like working with large education organizations, global, national school districts, and their leaders to improve K-12, K-16 education in the United States through the lens of equity. It's like, can we engage multiple stakeholders? Can we make sure that Black and brown people are at the table when big decisions about strategic plans that are going to impact their lives are at the table? And that work was awesome, but it was also tiring. And one of the things that made it tiring was that I was finding that the adults in the education system were really just struggling with their own relationships, especially when it came to talking about race, equity, and the kind of humility that we need to bring to those conversations, to acknowledge, like, again, that they're hard. And the humility piece comes into the Workplaces Healing Space. So what is Workplaces Healing Space? Ultimately, it's Be Free is about cultivating equity leadership inside of organizations so that we can center humanity and equity in service of individual and collective sustainability, well-being, and freedom. And by freedom, we mean a version of like wholeness. And that's kind of where the healing orientation comes in. much of what we find that people don't feel in the workplace, and this does vary by race and ways that people identify, gender, ability, status, a number of different ways folks identify, is they don't feel seen, heard, valued, voiced, and fully self-expressed. And so, again, centering this idea that can work be a place that contributes to your well-being rather than detracts from it? Like, can you go home not feeling depleted, irrespective of what you do, whether you're a knowledge worker, as we put it, or an essential worker, right? Like, can actually the process of work be helping you, not detracting from you? And so the notion of workplace as healing space, just to kind of come back, I was attracted to education and I was attracted to the workplace because these are places where we all go. It's like, you want to touch humanity, go to these places, in the United States specifically, right? That's where we show up. And so it's not just about work and ways we can change the conditions of work, but the workplace is a lever for systemic change, right? Everybody works. And in the United States, we self-identify through work as well. So it becomes a very powerful place. I'll also credit the workplace to say, you know, in the last few years, a cognizance that that the workplace is a place to work out some of these larger issues that do have this systemic context, but absolutely show up in the workplace as this microcosm of our systems. Like, people have more courage, in my mind. And I would say some of this has been a political, you know, a function of our politics. Like, I think people are more tired, you know, of the polarization and the ways in which the politicization of race and equity issues have kind of kept us at a standstill and just in these stalemates. And I think there's a different approach. So I commend the workplace for really wanting to come online and use the workplace as a space to work out and to heal, right? And we think about healing, there's learning, there's healing, and there's mobilizing. And I think they're all interconnected. Healing is not just like catharsis for the sake of it. Healing enables us to actually engage in relationships because we're going to need relationships. We're interdependent. Like, we're going to need them to collectively solve these issues. So I'll pause there. There's a lot more I could say, but
yeah. And I think, thank you for kind of defining and creating that framework, defining healing, the workplace is a healing space. So what are those elements, or what are the pillars? Like, if an organization is wanting to start this process, what does that look like?
Yeah. So I'll take that from the perspective of like equity leadership. So one of the things we talk about is the idea that ultimately there are ways you can skill build. The same way you can skill build for leadership, you can skill build for equity leadership. And we focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion, but with a heavy emphasis on equity. And I sometimes say equity leadership because that's like the game. That's where we're trying to go. We're trying to embody what is the thing we're trying to become more of. We're trying to become more equitable fundamentally. And very often people start with the idea, and I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent about the distinction between equity, diversity, and inclusion for folks. Or JEDI, you know, which we talked about earlier, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, which is a term I love, just because it's super fun and it's dope. It's like, we do need to elevate our thinking about what's possible, right? Can we become JEDIs in this space? Like, yes, we can. We have so much human potential that's untapped. So on the distinction between equity, diversity, and inclusion. So when I was sort of talking about the workplace and what people feel and don't feel based on what we've heard, and based on our work with clients, and our clients are cross-industry, philanthropies, nonprofits. We work with B Corps. We work with small businesses. We work with freelancers. And we're really in the inquiry when we decide who we want to work with, and we have that privilege and respect that the organizations who work with us have that privilege on their end, to make this sort of mutual choice about being in relationship. When we decide that, we really think about, why are we working with this organization? Like, what is the impact we can co-create if we choose to partner with you? So just to come back to equity leadership and what that is, as distinct from diversity and inclusion. Diversity, you could just think of as like, my colleagues at Project Inkblot who have a method that they call design for diversity, will describe, diversity as kind of numbers. It's just like the composition. Is there enough difference in background, perspective, race, ethnicity, orientation, gender, sexual, otherwise, in who is represented. And why does that matter? Because as the research shows, there's a business case for it. The organizations that have more diversity at leadership levels in particular are better able to function in complexity and thrive in crisis mode, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. You're not narrowing your perspectives to just a single and over-indexing on one person's point of view, which is exactly what you don't want to do when you're leaning into, heavy growth cycles or lots of change and transition. But diversity is just that. And in some ways, to me, sometimes the way I put it is like diversity is, period. It's the truth of who we are in the United States. Like, we're founded on this beautiful premise of heterogeneity. We struggle to really embody it, right? With our immigration policy and with all of these other ways, we struggle to embody it in so much as like a Black man was written into the Constitution as 3/5 of a human. That doesn't feel like it is embodying the aspiration that we have set out. And at the same time, the premise itself, the ideal and the possibility, is really just this recognition, like, we can be heterogeneous. How can we together navigate that? So in many ways, like, biodiversity is, like, you go outside, trees are all different colors, shapes, sizes, flora and fauna are all different. Like, diversity is a fact of our life. That's another way that I think of what diversity is. Inclusion is, do people feel, and I'm going to talk about that from a metrics and a data standpoint, like, do people feel? That matters, that framing. So do people feel that they are valued, seen, heard, supported in their self-expression in the workplace, whatever their jobs are, like actually able to do their jobs and equipped and supported? And do they feel that when they speak, when they contribute, when they seek to communicate, there is receptivity to that communication? That's inclusion. Do they feel when they make a request or have a voice, want to have a voice in a decision, that their voice is weighted and valued? And I want people to understand that inclusion doesn't mean you have to have consensus-based decision making. Like, hierarchy exists, but can we view hierarchy not as the default, but as a tool, right? Like, we utilize hierarchy consciously in service of getting something done, because sometimes we need hierarchy, right? But do we always need it? Not necessarily. And if we are over-attached to hierarchy, are we missing some of the voices we fail to elevate, which often happens by race, gender, and otherwise, because we're biased. So inclusion is, to go back to the piece about, do people feel? So there's this notion of, how do we measure, like, what is happening? How might we think about measuring inclusion or progress in race equity work and in equity work overall? Ask people what their experience is, right? So there is the facet of data that we encourage our clients. We start with like these discovery phases, so that to build a client's self-awareness at the individual level and the collective level of what is happening for you. Can you locate yourself in this moment of, like, what is happening on the equity front? And that is part of building people's equity leadership, right? Like, equity leadership is self-leadership. It's the capacity to be responsible for an issue and responsible for the way you're showing up in your relationships with the people you lead, the people you work with, and so on in the workplace. Responsible versus reactive, right? So I'm jumping around a little bit, but to come back, like, asking, so there's the data on, get clear on what are your retention numbers look like. One of the reasons organizations don't get clear on data is because they know it's going to reflect some really uncomfortable truths. And there's a beautiful quote that I love by Ruby Sales. I quote it a lot. She's a leader in the Southern Freedom Movement, as she calls it, which was right next to the Civil Rights Movement. And she kind of distinguishes the two by saying the Southern Freedom Movement was largely led by Black women and had this sort of feminine ethos. But her quote is, "Sometimes we have to go to uncomfortable places to locate the truth." And in my personal experience of life, I'm like, basically the only way I locate the truth when I'm showing up in a relationship in a way I don't want to is to go to uncomfortable place. I'm kind of like, it always takes uncomfortable, like going to
Yeah.
uncomfortable places, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we embrace that and lean into it? That's such a facet of this work too. So yeah, just to wrap up on that piece, take a look at who you are, right? Build that self-awareness through looking at your retention numbers, looking at who's in leadership, looking at divides along race, equity, and otherwise, right? And concurrently, right next to that, when you want to measure progress, both look at those indicators, but also ask people, like not just in surveys, but I kind of describe this. This is part of what we cultivate with organizations as part of equity leadership. Can you make unmediated sense of what is happening by not looking at, like go talk to a person about their story, right? And build this unmediated intelligence, this humanistic intelligence from another person. Like listen to what they're saying, the impact of the way things are is on them. That helps us become much smarter, much more collectively intelligent and astute about the nuances. Because also, like, not all Black people are the same person. It's not a monolith, right? Not all people of color are the same. So
absolutely. And so you're making me think about a couple. So everything you're sharing, you're making me think about a couple important things. I think when organizations are wanting to take on this work, how do you prep them to get them to start doing this work at all different levels? And I think part of the prep that's popping into my head is organizations be like, okay, we're going to do this work. And then they kind of expect it and like, okay, in a month, we're going to be good to go. And how do you kind of frame it in a way where this is actually going to be years in the process in the making, and there's going to be so many different people at so many different stages?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I really appreciate it. So one of the frames is, that's part of why we call it equity leadership and what we're in the business of cultivating in organizations at all levels. You don't have to be a leader by virtue of the power or authority that's conferred upon you because you're located at the top of the organization. In our view, anybody can be a leader. A leader is somebody who has an embodied self-awareness, who has the capacity to take responsibility for themselves, and who has an intention to create well-being. I'll add that as a sort of loaded piece, but it took us a really long time to get here. So just considering who we are as humans, it's going to take us a long time to respond, right, to this issue. I mean, how long has race equity? It's built into our very foundation. And if I add in the indigenous element, one way to see the way that we interacted with indigenous folks from the inception was we imposed a system of ownership, like the concept of land ownership, onto indigenous peoples, and that wasn't their concept. And so there wasn't like a dialogue there. Was there a conversation there? No, there was, right? And so this is built into our very foundations for hundreds of years. And we have wounds. Like Black people came to the United States by being enslaved and put to work. And this is part of why work is such a, lever for this change, because I think so much of our history is embedded still in the way that we work. We view humans as resources. This is a term that really gets me, and I have deep respect for people who work in human resources. It's a hard job. And I've always been curious, like, is there a higher prevalence of people of color who work in human resources? I that's been my observation. I have not actually looked up the data, but I'm curious about that, because I wonder how much like the importance of humanity and relationships is to people who are really adversely impacted by our bias, right, in the space. So, it's going to take us a while to respond, because it took us a long time to get here. So there are a lot of pieces to it. The systems are all interlocked. And so it requires patience. The other thing I'll say is the frame that we use is, we call it equity leadership, because it's kind of like the same idea as leadership. Like, do you fix leadership? Is that something you solve in a day? Does somebody take a leadership workshop and all of a sudden they're like the best CEO or the best leader in your company ever? No, it's an ongoing. Do you fix culture? Like if we don't fix, right? We respond. It's an attunement to a different approach. It's not about fixing. And I would also say that, where does fixing come from us? in our nervous systems, in our cells. And maybe I'll pause in a second, but I would love to talk about the nervous system and its role in this work. But like, where does that come from? Fixing is a desire to sort of shut down and control because we're afraid, whereas responding is just like, oh, we got to get in a rhythm with this because we're going to keep showing up every day to do this, you know?
And yeah, I'd love for you to dive into the nervous system. I think it's really important to think about when we're doing this type of work. Like, it's at the end of the day, it's with humans, right? And humans are they're biological entities with
totally.
And the nervous system plays an integral role where there's that dance between things that are happening externally and then what's happening internally with us at all different levels. So love for you to share about that as well.
Yeah. So to give a little bit more concreteness about like what we do and speak to the nervous system through that lens, like we facilitate learning and healing conversations in organizations as an example. And we may do that at a macro level, like whole group, large groups, maybe by race, by issue, if there's been a conflict or a rupture in the organization around race equity. Another thing we do is we coach individuals and we coach groups as a whole. So we create communities of practice. And we design that very intentionally. Then this is going to go back to safety, and this is where we get into the nervous system. We design communities of practice to be these spaces where people can show up and bring all of their discomforts about a particular issue they may be facing, or if we're in teaching mode, which we're teaching you a skill or a practice about how you can relate differently when it comes to race, how you can speak differently when it comes to race, that you can come and show up in that space in a messy way, like just as you are, knowing what you know, not knowing all the things you know. Like for many people, we're still defining what these terms are because this is a new conversation for many folks. Like, cool, can we not shame, blame, and judge you for the fact that it's a new conversation, but just meet you right here. It's a new conversation. How do we move forward from here, right? And so we design the conditions of that community space to evoke greater safety. And the purpose of safety, and I want to acknowledge that different people are going to feel safe or unsafe as a function of many, many things in their lives. But part of the focus on safety is we need enough safety to do two things. One is when we feel safe, we can lean into our difference without feeling threatened. And I'll get specific on the nervous system side of why that is the case. When we feel safe, we have a greater capacity to actually feel uncomfortable. And that might feel odd, but it's like, another way to put that is, people talk about safe space versus brave space, because not everybody's going to feel safe in the same ways, right? Like safety, different cues of the environment, different aspects of your relationship with someone, your dynamics, they're going to contribute to your feeling of safety or lack thereof. But bravery, right? So can we create enough safety that evokes bravery, that people are willing to have the courage to speak their truth? Again, even if it's a messy truth, because we can't actually move forward and learn until we've acknowledged what we know and what we don't know. Like we can't move forward and heal until we've acknowledged that like we're not healed on certain things. We're
Absolutely.
Wounded on them and we don't know how to speak to them, right? Like, and then we can't mobilize. We can't actually meet each other. So what the nervous system piece, and this is part of where we draw on as we design the conditions for these conversations very intentionally, and the conditions of the coaching that we do as well. So one is to even recognize that our nervous systems are at play. We want people to recognize, like, you have a nervous system. You have one, I have one. Two is there's this whole body of work called polyvagal theory. Stephen Porges is the neuroscientist whose theory this work is. And it's so brilliant and awesome. And I encourage people to get familiar with it. But in polyvagal theory, he identifies 4 primary states that we're in. So there are 3 of them that I like to call the FFFs because that's what it feels like to be in them. It's like one long F: fight, flight, freeze. So when we are in a state of fight, flight, which are both connected to our sympathetic nervous systems, And most of this stuff that's happening this is our autonomic nervous system. It's unconscious to us. It's not at the forefront of our consciousness. So a lot of our work is about making explicit and bringing into consciousness and awareness what is unconscious for folks. So when we're in fight, flight, freeze, that impacts the way we decision make, the way we communicate, and really critically, the way we make sense and meaning of what is happening in a given circumstance. So part of, if I were to walk you through like what it might feel like to be in one of our communities of practice, it's like, cool. So number one, locate yourself. Like, are you in fight, flight? Yes. Okay. How do you know? What are the sensations that cue you into that? I might feel a tightening in my stomach. I might feel a tightening in my chest. Great. What are the emotions that arise from that? Well, I'm angry. So-and-so, made a microaggression toward me, or so-and-so didn't call out somebody else for making a microaggression. Okay, cool. So you're angry and so. And then we kind of go through this process of, as you're telling the story that you have, just like noticing how connected that story is to your body sensations. What happens to us when we're in fight flight is we feel threatened. We don't feel safe. But I want to really make this very important point, which is like that state is pro-survival. Our bodies want to heal themselves. There is a lot of wisdom in being in fight flight, right? So an example of that is evolutionarily, why did we develop that capacity as far as we understand? So the theories say, if there was a lion coming at you in the wild, you need to be able to either flee to survive, right? To be pro-survival, or you need to engage with them and fight. And so that's a pro-survival state. There's wisdom when we are in that charged state, but can we mine the wisdom as opposed to get over-identified with the state and then become reactive? That's the possibility. The other state, a couple of really interesting things about being in that state in our nervous system. We lose peripheral vision, which I like to think of metaphorically, right? Like the whole purpose of that state is to help us react, to get super quick, to make unilateral decisions, to jump out of the way if there's a bus or a lion coming. And so it's not a state in which we're showing up with one another in a way where we're coordinating, we're communicating. And we're also not able to hold difference. Like difference is threat. Difference signals threat when we're in that state, right? So just imagine when people are coming into these conversations really charged and in a state of fight or flight, which being in the workplace just generally does for lots of people, right? What is your capacity to have that conversation? Freeze is a state where we tend to feel like I can't, I'm overwhelmed, and I'm shut down. And the pro-survival purpose of that state is to conserve energy. Like we've just we're beyond our capacity, and we need to pull into ourselves. We actually need to stop. And if we don't stop ourselves early enough, we will get stopped because our bodies want to support us. They want to heal us. So that stops us. Socially engaged is this state and the facet of our nervous systems that came online evolutionarily later. And social engagement is our capacity for joy, compassion, groundedness. The other things are we're able to hold multiple seemingly irreconcilable differences when we are in a state of social engagement. So our capacity to lean into the fact that you're different from me, while we also have a sameness. So I can feel my connectedness to you because I feel safe with you in that state. But I can also acknowledge that you're different from me without feeling threatened by that difference. That's super fundamental for this work in my mind. So in that state, we also have a greater capacity to communicate, coordinate with each other, and like sit and take in like 10 different people's perspectives at the same time. Lateral thinking, divergent thinking, creativity is much higher. So creativity helps us with our decisions. We don't only feel like either I have to shut down this race equity conversation and this conflict, or I have to run into it and be super angry. It's like, oh, there's like actually other options.
Yeah.
Like, right. The last thing I'll say is I really want to, this is so important at the macro level too. Like anger is not bad. Being in fight or flight is not bad. Part of the point is, can we find the wisdom in each of those states? And can we grow our capacity to be with the fact that those states show up in each of us every single day in dynamic ways from moment to moment? And can we recognize the importance of that in this work? Because the way I'll put it is, the more capacity you have to be in any one of those states, the more capacity you have to relate with someone else who triggers those states in you.
Absolutely.
So if I'm a white person and I'm afraid of you because you're Black, right? If I can hold that fear and acknowledge that difference, maybe I can engage with you in a way where I feel less threatened just by virtue of your race, right? Like I can actually engage with you as opposed to want to fight or flee. So I'll pause there, but
no, and I, as we start like wrapping up, I think one of the things that you've done is really taking us through this really important journey of kind of self-development and looking within, and some of the things that you really have to take into account when you're doing all of this work. Like, obviously we're working within an organization, but there's so many elements that we really have to think about on an individual level in order to kind of start. I was talking with B-Lab earlier about, yes, we want to use organizations to pull this big lever in the context of what's happening in the world, but there might be smaller levers that you need to be pulling internally or within oneself in order to have the strength to pull that bigger lever.
Totally. I mean, I think it's both and, right? And the way I see it, when I go back to the systems level thinking, the systems we create out there and that we perpetuate out there begin with us. Like, who creates a process? Who gives life to a process and a law, and who makes decisions that perpetuate that? Like, we all do. Right. So the more self-aware we are, and this is not about bootstrapping and like placing blame. It's very different. It's actually about, the more self-aware we are, the more powerful we are. We're connected to our agency, and there's much more choicefulness. The moment, right, I know that something's happening, I can choose that I can choose to show up a different way. I can choose to recognize that, like, oh, I am biased in this moment. Like, I'm biased, in favor. And how about I don't judge myself for being biased, but actually recognize, okay, there's a new opportunity. I can learn and evolve from that space. The last thing I'll say is, this is a conversation about well-being, very fundamentally. Like, people, when your nervous system, when you're in relationship and you're charging each other's nervous system, it impacts your well-being at the most fundamental levels, right? When we're having this conversation in a polarized, politicized way at the macro level, we're hurting our well-being. And so you can think about this as, the more self-awareness you build, the better able you are to take care of yourself and to take care of others in the space. It's like that fundamental and that human,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Nita. And thanks for sharing all of this amazing important work. You gave, I think, the audience and listeners a very different perspective on some of the other conversations we're having, but a much needed perspective. So where can people find more about you all?
Yeah, it's Be Free. We leave out the E, so it's BFREE.LIVE.live. We're also on LinkedIn under my name, Nita Baum, and Facebook. We're on some of the channels as well. Starting a little series of case stories that we've begun about equity leadership, using storytelling to kind of bring to the fore some concepts and practices folks can use. That's on YouTube as well under my name, which is where our Be Free account is. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing all your insights and your story.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this series and this much needed work in the world. It's really wonderful to be in community with you. Grateful.
Great.